"I don't talk much, sir, but I cook well," the young woman said, her voice barely audible over the mountain wind, clutching a worn leather satchel that held every spice she owned in the world. The lonely Cahto Recluse studied her for a long moment, then turned toward his cabin and said simply, "You start at dawn, Northern California, September 1881, where the ancient redwoods met the sky and civilization, became nothing more than a distant memory carried on the evening breeze." The sun hung low over the Mendocino Range, casting long shadows through trees that had been standing when Spanish conquistadors first set foot on California soil, their massive trunks creating cathedral-like spaces where light filtered down in golden shafts thick with pine dust and the whispered secrets of countless seasons. This was Cahto territory, land that belonged to people who measured time not in years, but in the turning of leaves, the migration of salmon, the birth and death of generations who understood that some places were too sacred for maps.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The air here carried stories that most white settlers would never hear, tales of spirits that moved through the forest like wind through branches, of ancient hunting grounds where the very stones held memories of ceremonies performed when the world was younger and the boundary between the living and the dead was as thin as morning mist. Matthew Eaglerin stood on the ridge above his cabin, a solitary figure carved from the same granite determination that had shaped these mountains over millennia. At 34, he carried himself with the fluid grace of someone equally at home tracking deer through dense undergrowth or reading the weather patterns in cloud formations that most white men couldn't even see. His hair fell past his shoulders, in traditional Cahto fashion, black as obsidian, and usually tied back with strips of deer hide his grandmother had taught him to prepare when he was barely old enough to hold a skinning knife. His father's Scottish blood showed in his height and the sharp angles of his cheekbones, but his mother's Cahto heritage lived in his eyes, dark and knowing, capable of seeing things that existed in the spaces between what most people called reality. Those eyes had watched his mother's people be driven from their ancestral lands, had seen his father drink himself to death rather than face the consequences of loving a woman whose very existence challenged everything white society believed about the natural order of things. The cabin behind him was built into the mountainside itself, constructed with the patient skill of someone who understood that shelter should work with the land rather than against it. Logs cut from trees that had fallen naturally, stones gathered from the creek bed below, a roof designed to shed snow and channel rainwater into carefully carved channels that fed his small garden. No nails, no store-bought materials, nothing that would mark it as the dwelling of someone who acknowledged the existence of the outside world. He had built it with his own hands over the course of 2 winters, working slowly and deliberately, creating not just a home, but a statement of independence from a world that had never quite known what to do with someone who belonged fully to neither the white nor the Indian way of life. The structure seemed to grow from the mountainside itself, so perfectly integrated with its surroundings that passing travelers might walk within 50 feet of it and never suspect human habitation. For 8 years, he had lived here in complete solitude, speaking to no one except the ravens who nested in the towering pines and occasionally the traveling Cahto hunters who passed through on their way to the traditional salmon runs along the Eel River. 8 years of sunrise and sunset, measured not by clocks but by the movement of shadows across his small clearing. 8 years of meals consisting of whatever he could hunt, trap, or coax from the thin mountain soil. 8 years of silence so complete that he had almost forgotten the sound of his own voice, the cadence of conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing thoughts with another human being, who might understand the subtle differences between observation and wisdom. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, retreating from a world that seemed determined to force him into categories that felt like cages. But lately he had begun to wonder if solitude and loneliness were the same thing, and if so, whether He had made a terrible mistake. The mountain provided everything he needed for basic survival, but survival and living were two entirely different endeavors. His days followed patterns established by necessity rather than pleasure, rising before dawn to check his trap lines, spending daylight hours hunting or gathering, devoting the long evenings to maintaining his gear, and preparing for whatever challenges the changing seasons might bring. It was a life that made sense, a life that allowed him to exist without compromising the principles his mother had died trying to instill in him. But it was also a life that had gradually worn away his connection to the parts of himself that thrived on human contact, shared laughter, the simple joy of preparing food for someone who might appreciate the effort involved. He heard her before he saw her, which should have been impossible. He could track a wounded bear through dense brush in complete darkness, could identify individual animals by the sound of their breathing, could tell from 50 yards away whether approaching footsteps belonged to friend or potential threat. But this young woman had somehow climbed nearly 2 miles of treacherous mountain trail without making enough noise to alert him until she was already standing at the edge of his clearing, which meant either she possessed woodcraft skills that rivaled his own, or she was so exhausted that she had been moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew that a single misstep would send her tumbling down the rocky slope to certain death. The fact that she had found his cabin at all suggested planning and determination, since there were no marked trails leading to his sanctuary, no signs indicating human habitation, nothing but animal paths and the kind of subtle navigation markers that most people would miss entirely. Esperanza Torres stood swaying slightly at the tree line, her dark hair escaping from a braid that had probably been neat and tidy when she started climbing that morning but now hung in strands around a wound face marked by exhaustion, determination, and something else that Matt recognized from his own mirror on the bad days. Desperation, but the kind that had been tempered by pride into something harder and more dangerous. She wore the traveling clothes of someone who had been on the road for weeks, maybe months, a faded blue dress over practical wool leggings, boots that had been well made once, but were now held together by careful stitching and stubborn will. Her hands gripped a leather satchel with the kind of protective intensity usually reserved for newborn babies or family heirlooms. And when the mountain wind caught it just right, he could smell something that made his mouth water despite himself: cinnamon. He realized. And something else, something rich and complex that spoke of carefully guarded secrets passed down through generations of women who understood that food could be medicine, comfort, seduction, or salvation depending on who was doing the cooking and why. The scent seemed impossible in this place where his own meals consisted primarily of venison jerky, pine nut mush, and whatever edible plants he could gather in season. It was like catching a whiff of a different world entirely, one where people cared about more than simple survival, where meals were events worth anticipating rather than chores to be completed as efficiently as possible. He found himself wondering what other treasures might be hidden in that carefully guarded satchel. What culinary mysteries she had carried up his mountain like offerings to an unknown god. Her eyes swept the clearing with the practiced assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate potential shelter quickly and accurately. She noted the neat arrangement of his outdoor workspace, the carefully tended garden plot where late vegetables still showed green against the approaching autumn, the shed where he stored his hunting and trapping gear. Her gaze lingered on the forge where he shaped his own tools and arrowheads, the wood pile stacked with mathematical precision, the small details that revealed a man who took pride in self-sufficiency despite the isolation. When her eyes finally met his, he saw intelligence there and wariness, and something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been beaten down too many times to show itself openly. "Mister," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Suggeste. Spanish was her first language, but English had been learned young and spoken often. The formality was deliberate, maintaining distance until she could gauge his intentions. "I don't mean to trespass on your land,"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
I was told in the valley that you might have work for someone willing to earn their keep. Her eyes swept the clearing. Again, taking inventory of possibilities, estimating the kind of labor that might be required to maintain this carefully ordered sanctuary. I don't talk much, sir, but I cook well. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that went far beyond their simple meaning. Matt studied her face, noting the way she held herself with carefully controlled tension, the protective distance she maintained despite her obvious need, the way her free hand stayed close to the knife at her belt without making it appear threatening. She had been hurt, and recently, by someone who should have protected her instead. The knowledge hit him with unexpected force, awakening protective instincts he had thought were buried permanently under 8 years of deliberate isolation. Something about her reminded him of the wild creatures he occasionally found injured near his cabin. Creatures that would accept help if it was offered carefully enough, but would flee at the first sign of sudden movement or aggressive intention. Cook. What? He asked, his voice rusty from disuse. The question came out harsher than he intended, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, and he caught a glimpse of the steel that had carried her up his mountain despite whatever circumstances had made such a desperate journey necessary. Whatever you have, she replied simply, and there was something in her tone that suggested she had learned to work miracles with minimal resources. Whatever you can catch, trap, grow, or gather, I can make it taste like something worth living. For. She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully, calculating how much information to reveal without making herself vulnerable. I can make bread from acorn flour and wild honey. Stew from rabbit and whatever greens grow in shadow. I know 47 different ways to prepare venison, and 33 of them don't require salt. Despite himself, Matt felt his stomach respond to the implied promise in her words. When had he last eaten something that qualified as an actual meal rather than simple fuel for another day of solitary existence? When had he last tasted food that had been prepared with care, with attention to flavor and texture, and the simple pleasure of eating something that had been made by hands that understood the alchemy of combining simple ingredients into something approaching art? His own cooking consisted primarily of roasting meat over open flames and boiling whatever vegetables he could grow or gather into submission. Functional but utterly without joy or creativity. Why here? He asked, gesturing toward the wilderness that stretched in every direction from his small clearing. Town's 3 days' walk down the mountain. More opportunities there for someone with your skills. He studied her reaction carefully, noting the way her shoulders tensed at the mention of towns, the subtle tightening around her eyes that suggested painful associations with populated places. Esperanza's expression closed off slightly, and he recognized the look of someone who had learned that some stories were too dangerous to tell in full. Towns ask too many questions, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Want to know where you came from, where you're going, who your people are. Why a woman is traveling alone without male protection. I'm looking for somewhere that minds its own business, somewhere that values work over gossip. Matt nodded. Slowly, he understood about wanting to be left alone, about the luxury of existing without having to explain yourself to people who would never understand the choices that had brought you to the place where you stood. But he also understood that 8 years of complete solitude had left him starved for human connection in ways he hadn't fully recognized until this moment. Watching this young woman stand at the edge of his world like a question he wasn't sure he was brave enough to answer. The mountain had given him peace, but it had also taken something essential, something he was only now realizing he missed. What's your name? He asked, though he suspected whatever she told him would be carefully edited for his consumption. Hope. She said, which he was certain wasn't entirely true, but was probably true enough for current purposes. Hope Torres. The surname carried weight, suggested family connections and cultural heritage that might explain both her obvious skills and her current circumstances. And you are? Matthew Eagle Run. People used to call me Matt, before I stopped knowing people who called me anything. He found himself almost smiling at the rusty sound of his own attempt at humor, surprised by how good it felt to engage in even this basic level of social interaction. I don't have much to offer in terms of wages. This isn't exactly a place where money means much, and I don't see many traveling merchants up here looking to purchase goods or services. Hope's eyes swept the clearing again, but this time her gaze lingered on details that spoke of careful maintenance, of someone who took pride in keeping his small world in good order despite the isolation. The neatly stacked firewood cut to precise lengths, the herbs hanging to dry under the cabin's eaves, the small forge where he shaped his own tools and arrowheads with the skill of someone who had learned metalworking as both necessity and art form. A garden plot where late-season vegetables still showed green against the approaching autumn, evidence of agricultural knowledge that went beyond simple subsistence farming. I don't need wages, she said, and there was something in her voice that suggested money had recently become more of a liability than an asset. I need a place to stay through winter. Somewhere safe. Somewhere I can work without looking over my shoulder every few minutes. Somewhere I can be useful without being questioned about my past or my plans. She hefted the leather satchel slightly, as if reminding herself of the treasures it contained. I have my own supplies, my own tools, everything I need to practice my craft. All I need is a kitchen and ingredients to work with. Matt considered this proposal carefully, weighing the advantages and disadvantages of sharing his carefully ordered solitude with another person. His cabin had a stone fireplace large enough for cooking, though he had never used it for anything more elaborate than roasting meat on a spit or boiling water for pine needle tea. There was a root cellar where he stored his winter provisions, shelves that could hold whatever mysterious supplies she carried in that carefully guarded satchel. And winter was coming whether he acknowledged it or not, bringing with it the long months of enforced isolation when snow would make travel impossible, and the already limited daylight would shrink to a few precious hours of pale sun filtering through perpetually overcast skies. Having someone to share the long winter evenings might not be the worst thing in the world, especially someone who seemed to understand the value of companionable silence and productive work. And if that someone could transform his simple survival rations into actual meals worth anticipating, well, that might be closer to luxury than anything he had experienced since choosing this life of deliberate exile. But there were practical considerations beyond simple pleasure, questions about sleeping arrangements and privacy, and the thousand small adjustments that would be required to accommodate another person in a space designed for absolute solitude. "Show me," he said finally, the words coming out before he had fully decided to speak them. Hope blinked, momentarily uncertain. "Sir, you say you can cook. Show me what you can do with what I have available. I've got fresh trout from this morning's fishing, some wild onions I gathered yesterday, late carrots from the garden that need to be used before the first hard frost." He gestured toward the cabin, feeling oddly nervous about inviting another person into the space he had kept private for so many years. "There's a smokehouse with venison, dried berries, whatever else you think you might need. Prove to me that you're worth the trouble of sharing my winter with another person." For the first time since she had appeared in his tree line, Hope smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. The wariness fell away like a discarded cloak, revealing dimples and laugh lines that suggested she had not always lived the kind of life that required carrying knives and looking over shoulders with practiced paranoia. This was how she looked when she was happy, he realized, and the thought came with a surprising pang of something that might have been longing, if he had allowed himself to acknowledge such feelings. "Give me 2 hours," she said, moving toward The cabin with the confident stride of someone who had found familiar territory after a long journey through hostile landscape. And try to work up an appetite. What I'm going to make for you will require your full attention. She disappeared through his doorway with satchel in hand and purpose in her step, and Matt realized that he was about to discover whether 8 years of solitude had prepared him for the shock of sharing his carefully ordered world with another human being. As he settled onto the wooden bench outside his door, he caught himself wondering when he had stopped being Matthew Eagle Run, half Cahto tracker and reluctant hermit, and started being simply a man who was curious about what revelations the next 2 hours might bring. The sun continued its descent toward the western peaks, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber that made everything seem touched by magic. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called to its mate, and the evening breeze carried the scent of pine resin and the promise of the first frost that would mark the true beginning of mountain winter. The sound of activity from inside his cabin was strange and wonderful, like music he had forgotten existed. The soft clink of metal against stone, the whisper of someone moving with practiced efficiency through an unfamiliar space, the careful sounds of ingredients being combined with the kind of precision that suggested cooking was not just a necessity but a calling. For the first time in 8 years, he found himself anticipating something other than another day of simple survival. And the feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Hope Torres moved through Matthew's cabin like a woman surveying a battlefield, her experienced eyes cataloging every surface, every utensil, every possibility hidden within. The sparse but functional space. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, carved into the mountainside with the same careful attention to natural flow that characterized everything else about Matthew's sanctuary. Stone walls kept the interior cool in summer and would hold warmth through the bitter mountain winters, while carefully positioned windows captured morning light and evening breezes with architectural wisdom that spoke of someone who understood how to work with the land rather than against it. The main room served multiple purposes, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that could easily accommodate cooking for a dozen people, though it was clear from the simple spit and single pot that Matthew had never used it for anything approaching culinary ambition. She set her precious satchel on the rough wooden table that occupied the center of the room, running her fingers over leather worn smooth by countless miles of careful transport. This bag contained everything that remained of her former life, every secret her grandmother had whispered during long afternoons in the kitchen of their small house in Sonoma County, every technique her mother had demonstrated with patient repetition, until Hope's hands moved with the same instinctive grace. The satchel held more than spices and tools. It held the accumulated wisdom of generations of women who had understood that cooking was both survival skill and sacred art, a bridge between the physical world and the realm of memory, comfort, and love. Her fingers worked the familiar knots that secured the satchel's opening, a complex pattern her grandfather had taught her that would resist casual tampering, while allowing her to open it quickly in darkness if necessary. Inside, wrapped in silk scarves that had once belonged to her great-grandmother, lay treasures that would have seemed impossibly exotic to most frontier kitchens. Glass vials filled with saffron threads worth more than gold by weight, tiny cloth. Packets containing cardamom seeds, star anise, and cinnamon bark that had traveled by ship from lands whose names she knew only from whispered stories. A small wooden box held vanilla beans preserved in spirits so strong they could double as medicine, while another contained dried chiles that ranged from sweet and mild to searingly hot, each variety chosen for specific culinary applications that most cooks never imagined. But the real treasures were the tools, implements crafted by artisans who understood that cooking required instruments as precise as any surgeon's kit. A set of knives forged from steel that held an edge sharp enough to slice onions so thin they became translucent, their handles worn smooth by her grandmother's grip and later her own. A mortar and pestle carved from volcanic stone that could Reduce the hardest spices to powder fine as dust, seasoned by decades of use until the stone itself held the essence of 1,000 meals. Wooden spoons shaped for specific purposes, each one carved to perform tasks that mass-produced utensils could never accomplish with the same precision and grace. Matthew's kitchen held its own possibilities, she realized as she explored cabinets and shelves with the focused attention of someone accustomed to making miracles from minimal resources. Cast iron pans seasoned to mirror smoothness, proof that he understood at least the basics of maintaining cookware, even if he had never pushed those tools to their full potential. Dutch ovens that could serve double duty as roasting pans or bread ovens with the addition of carefully managed coals. A coffee grinder that could be repurposed for spices, and most promising of all, a collection of wooden bowls and ceramic crockery that suggested someone had once planned to use this kitchen for more than simple survival cooking. Hope tied her dark hair back with a strip of leather, transforming herself from weary traveler to focused artisan with the simple gesture. She had learned long ago that cooking required complete attention, that the difference between merely adequate food and transcendent nourishment lay in the cook's ability to be fully present in each moment of preparation. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she arranged her tools and ingredients, creating the kind of organized workspace that would allow her to focus entirely on the alchemy she was about to perform. The trout Matthew had mentioned lay on a wooden platter, their skin still bright with the silver sheen that spoke of recent capture from cold mountain streams. 3 fish, each roughly the size of her hand, their flesh firm and sweet with the clean taste of pure water and abundant insect life. She examined them with the careful attention of someone who understood that great cooking began with great ingredients, noting the clear eyes and bright red gills that confirmed their freshness. These fish had been caught by someone who knew his business, killed quickly and cleanly, stored properly in the cool shadows of the cabin's north wall. The wild onions were small but pungent, their papery skins concealing bulbs that would add sharp sweetness to whatever dish she created. She could smell their promise as she sorted through them, selecting the firmest specimens and setting aside any that showed signs of softening or decay. Mountain onions grew slowly in the thin soil and harsh climate, concentrating flavors that their valley cousins could never achieve, developing complex notes that would complement rather than overpower the delicate fish. The carrots from Matthew's garden were a revelation, thick and straight with the deep orange color that spoke of rich soil and careful tending. Someone had put considerable effort into creating growing conditions that could support such vegetables at this altitude, amending the native soil with compost and carefully managing water through the dry summer months. These carrots would be sweet and earthy, their flavor concentrated by the cool mountain nights that slowed their growth and intensified their natural sugars. But it was in Matthew's smokehouse that Hope discovered the true extent of his wilderness skills, and perhaps caught her first glimpse of the man he had been before 8 years of solitude had worn away, his connection to the pleasures of civilized living. Strips of venison hung in neat rows, cured to perfect texture with a combination of salt, smoke, and time that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations of hunters. Wild turkey, rabbit, and what looked like bear meat, all processed with the kind of careful attention that suggested someone who took pride in doing things properly, even when no one was watching. Dried berries hung in cloth sacks, sorted by type and carefully protected from moisture and insects. Huckleberries, elderberries, wild strawberries no bigger than her thumbnail, but intense with concentrated flavor. A fortune in wilderness provisions, she realized, enough to support not just survival but actual variety in diet through the long months when fresh foods would become impossible to obtain. This was not the larder of someone merely getting by. This was the work of someone who understood that eating well was one of the fundamental pleasures that made life worth living. Hope selected her ingredients with the careful deliberation of a painter choosing colors for a masterpiece. The trout would be the star of her performance, but they would need supporting players to create the kind of memorable meal that would convince Matthew Eaglerun to share his mountain sanctuary with a stranger. She took 2 of the fish and set the third aside, along with strips of the finest venison and a selection of the dried berries that would add complexity and surprise to what she had planned. Her hands moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been cooking since childhood, each motion economical and purposeful. She filleted the trout with surgical precision, removing bones with the kind of skill that could only come from years of practice, then set the pristine fillets aside while she prepared the aromatics that would transform simple fish into something approaching poetry. The wild onions went under her knife in paper-thin slices that would melt into sweetness when touched by heat, while the carrots became perfect julienne strips that would add color and textural contrast to the finished dish. From her precious collection of spices, she selected treasures that most frontier cooks had never heard of, much less learned to use properly. A pinch of saffron went into a small bowl with warm water, transforming the liquid into liquid gold. That would tint everything it touched with color and flavor that seemed to capture sunshine itself. Cardamom pods went into her mortar along with black peppercorns and a single-star anise, releasing fragrances that filled the cabin with scents that belonged in palace kitchens rather than mountain hideaways. The dried berries required their own preparation, soaked in a small amount of the precious brandy she carried for medicinal purposes until they plumped with absorbed spirits and began to release their concentrated essences. She would use them sparingly, she decided, just enough to add mysterious depths to the sauce she was already envisioning, complex notes that would complement the fish without overwhelming its delicate character. Matthew's cast iron pan heated over the coals with the slow, even warmth that could only come from properly seasoned metal, and Hope felt the familiar surge of anticipation that always accompanied the moment when preparation gave way to active cooking. This was when ingredients stopped being individual components and began their transformation into something greater than the sum of their parts, when her knowledge and intuition would guide the process toward the kind of perfection that made people remember a meal for the rest of their lives. The first trout fillet hit the hot pan with a satisfying sizzle that sent aromatic steam rising toward the cabin's rafters, and Hope felt her entire being focus down to the essential task of managing heat, timing, and technique with the precision of a master craftsman. The fish would need exactly 3 minutes on the first side, no more and no less, long enough to develop the golden crust that would seal in juices while creating textural contrast, but not so long that the delicate flesh would begin to toughen or dry out. While the fish cooked, she prepared the vegetables in a second pan, adding the sliced onions first to let them begin their slow transformation from sharp and pungent to sweet and golden. The smell that rose from the pan was the perfume of civilization itself, the scent that had drawn humans away from purely nomadic existence toward this settled life that made complex cooking possible. She could hear Matthew moving around outside the cabin, probably trying to appear busy while actually positioning himself where he could catch hints of what she was creating. The carrots went into the pan next, their natural sugars beginning to caramelize in the hot oil while their cellulose softened just enough to make them tender without destroying their essential character. Hope had learned long ago that vegetables, like people, revealed their best qualities only when treated with respect and patience, coaxed rather than forced toward their potential. The key was understanding that each ingredient had its own optimal cooking time and temperature, its own unique contribution to the finished dish. She flipped the trout with the kind of fluid motion that made difficult techniques appear effortless, revealing the golden brown crust she had been hoping to achieve. The second side would need only 90 seconds, just long enough to complete the cooking process without overcooking the fish to the point where it became dry and flaky instead of moist and tender. Timing was everything in cooking, she had learned from her grandmother. Timing and the willingness to pay attention to what the food itself was trying to tell you about its readiness. The saffron water went into the vegetable pan, along with a splash of the brandy that had been soaking the berries, creating a sauce that filled the cabin with fragrances that seemed to belong in dreams rather than reality. The alcohol would cook off quickly, she knew, leaving behind only the concentrated fruit flavors and the subtle complexity that spirits could add to savory dishes when used with a light hand. Too much and the dish would be overwhelmed by competing flavors. Too little, and the opportunity for transcendence would be lost. Hope plated the trout on one of Matthew's wooden plates, arranging the vegetables around the fish with the kind of attention to visual appeal that most frontier cooking ignored entirely. Food should please the eye as well as the palate, her mother had always insisted, because people began eating with their eyes long before the first bite reached their mouths. The golden fish contrasted beautifully with the bright orange carrots and the deep purple of the reconstituted berries, while the saffron-tinted sauce added both color and promise of flavors yet to be discovered. But she was not finished yet. From her satchel, she retrieved a small vial of oil that had been infused with wild herbs she had gathered during her journey across California, a mixture that would add the final note of complexity to her composition. Just a few drops, she told herself, drizzled over the finished plate with the restraint that separated great cooks from merely competent ones. The oil carried scents of sage and wild thyme, bay leaves, and something else she could never quite identify, but that seemed to capture the essence of the California wilderness itself. A final sprinkle of coarse salt, harvested from the coastal waters near her childhood home and carried carefully across hundreds of miles in a small leather pouch. This salt carried traces of seaweed and ocean spray, flavors that would remind the fish of its aquatic origins, while enhancing rather than masking its natural character. The crystals caught the lamplight like tiny diamonds, adding textural interest, and the promise of flavor bursts that would appear throughout the eating experience. She stepped back to survey her work with the critical eye of someone who had learned that details mattered, that the difference between good food and great food often lay in the final touches that less experienced cooks might dismiss as unnecessary fussiness. But she knew better. Every element on that plate had been chosen for a specific purpose. Every flavor had been balanced against its companions to create harmony rather than competition. Every technique had been employed in service of creating something memorable rather than merely adequate. The sound of boots on the cabin's wooden steps announced Matthew's return from whatever busy work he had been using to occupy himself while she worked her kitchen magic. Hope heard him pause just outside the door, probably steeling himself for whatever revelations awaited him inside. She could understand his apprehension. He had lived alone for 8 years, eating simple survival fare that prioritized nutrition and convenience over pleasure or artistry. What she had created for him represented a fundamental shift in how he might think about the daily ritual of eating. When he stepped through the doorway, she watched his face carefully for the first reaction to the transformed atmosphere inside his cabin. The air was thick with layered fragrances that spoke of complexity and sophistication, scents that seemed impossible in this remote mountain setting. His nostrils flared slightly as he processed the olfactory information, his expression shifting from cautious curiosity to something approaching wonder. "Smells like a different world in here," he said quietly, and she heard genuine amazement in his voice. This was a man who had forgotten that food could be more than fuel. She realized, someone who had trained himself to ignore the sensual pleasures that cooking could provide. But his body remembered, even if his conscious mind had suppressed the knowledge, and she could see him responding to the promise of what awaited him. Hope gestured toward the table where she had set his plate, along with simple cutlery and a cup of clear mountain water to cleanse his palate between bites. "It's nothing fancy," she said, though they both knew she was being modest. "Just mountain trout prepared the way my grandmother taught me, with a few things from my collection to make it interesting." Matthew approached the table like a man walking toward an altar, his movements careful and reverent in a way that suggested he understood he was about to participate in something approaching ceremony. He sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on the plate before him, taking in the careful arrangement of colors and textures. The way the sauce caught the lamplight, the delicate garnish of herbs that added final notes of green to the composition. Hope held her breath as Matthew lifted the fork, cut a piece of the trout, and raised it toward his mouth with the deliberate motion of someone who understood that this moment would determine more than just his opinion of her cooking skills. This bite would decide whether she had earned the right to stay, whether her offer of culinary services in exchange for shelter would be accepted, whether she had found sanctuary or would need to continue her dangerous journey toward an uncertain destination. The fish disappeared between his lips, and she watched his expression change as the flavors registered on his palate. First surprise, as if he had forgotten that food could actually taste like something other than simple nourishment. Then pleasure, as the carefully balanced combination of ingredients created the kind of harmony that great cooking could achieve, when all elements worked together rather than competing for attention. Finally, something that looked almost like pain, as if the pleasure of eating something truly delicious was awakening hungers he had spent years trying to suppress. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, his eyes closing briefly as he concentrated on the experience of actually tasting his food rather than simply consuming it for sustenance. When he swallowed, he remained silent for a long moment, and Hope felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his verdict. Had she misjudged what would appeal to someone who had lived so simply for so long? Had she made the mistake of creating something too complex, too far removed from the basic foods he had grown accustomed to? "I had forgotten," Matthew said. Finally, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "I had forgotten that eating could be something other than a chore that needed to be completed 3 times a day." He took another bite, this time including vegetables and sauce, along with the fish, experiencing the way different flavors played against each other on his tongue. "This is what food used to taste like, before I stopped caring about such things." Hope felt relief flood through her system like warm brandy, followed immediately by something that felt suspiciously like pride. She had not simply fed this man, she had reminded him of pleasures he had abandoned, reconnected him with a part of himself that 8 years of isolation had nearly destroyed. This was why she cooked, she realized, not just to satisfy hunger, but to create moments of connection and joy that made life worth living. Matthew ate with the focused attention of someone rediscovering a lost language, pausing between bites to fully appreciate what she had accomplished with such simple ingredients. He asked questions about her techniques, about the spices she had used, about where she had learned to combine flavors in ways that created such complex and satisfying results. His interest was genuine and informed, revealing a palate that had been educated before isolation had narrowed his culinary horizons to simple survival. "My grandmother," Hope answered when he asked about her training. She came from Mexico with recipes that had been passed down through her family for generations. "My mother learned from her, and she taught me, though I never imagined I would need those skills to survive on my own." She paused, not wanting to reveal too much about the circumstances that had led her to his mountain. "Food was love in our family, the way women showed they cared for their people." Matthew nodded slowly, understanding more than she had said aloud. "You can stay," he said simply, setting down his fork and meeting her eyes directly. "Through the winter, through spring if you want. I can't pay wages, but you'll have shelter, safety, and whatever ingredients this mountain can provide." He gestured toward the empty plate. "Anyone who can create something like this from trout and vegetables deserves better than whatever brought you up here running." Hope felt tears threatening at the edges of her vision, relief and gratitude overwhelming. Her careful composure. She had found sanctuary, earned her place through the ancient currency of nourishment skillfully provided. "Thank you," she whispered. "You won't regret this decision." "I know I won't," Matthew replied, and for the first time since her arrival, she saw him smile with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the mountain, Hope Torres. I have a feeling this winter is going to be very different from the last 8. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and the mountain settled into evening quiet, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the whisper of wind through pine branches. Inside the cabin, two people who had been strangers that morning began the delicate process of learning to share space and solitude, bound together by the simple miracle of a perfectly prepared meal and the promise of many more to come. Dawn came to the mountain with the hushed reverence of cathedral light filtering through stained glass windows, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber that made the ordinary world seem touched by divine grace. Hope woke to the sound of Matthew moving quietly around the cabin, his boots careful on the wooden floor as he tried not to disturb her sleep in the small alcove he had hastily prepared the night before. She had insisted on sleeping near the kitchen, claiming she needed to tend the fire through the night, but they both understood it was really about maintaining proper boundaries in a situation that could easily become complicated if either of them forgot the practical nature of their arrangement. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn chill, braiding her hair back with practiced efficiency, before emerging from behind the curtain Matthew had rigged to give her privacy. He stood at the window with a cup of coffee, watching the sun climb over the eastern ridge with the patient attention of someone who had learned to find meaning in the daily miracle of returning light. When he heard her footsteps, he turned with a slight smile that transformed his weathered features. "Morning," he said, gesturing toward the coffee pot warming over the coals. "Figured you might want some before we start the day." His voice carried none of the uncertainty from the previous evening, as if the simple act of sharing a meal had established a foundation of mutual respect that made further awkwardness unnecessary. Hope poured herself coffee in one of his carved wooden cups, inhaling the bitter fragrance that spoke of beans carried up the mountain at considerable expense and effort. "You're up early," she observed, noting that he was already dressed for outdoor work, his leather vest buckled over a wool shirt that had seen many seasons of hard use. "Mountain habit," Matthew replied. "Light comes late and leaves early this time of year. Have to make the most of what we get." He finished his coffee with the efficient motion of someone who had places to be and work to accomplish. "Thought I'd show you around today, help you understand what resources we have to work with. Winter changes everything up here, and you'll need to know what's available when the snow starts flying." Matthew led Hope on a tour that revealed the true extent of his wilderness mastery, taking her to places that would remain accessible, even when snow made travel beyond the immediate clearing impossible. The smokehouse was only the beginning of an elaborate system for food preservation and storage that spoke of someone who had learned to think in terms of seasons and cycles rather than simple day-to-day survival. Behind the cabin, built into the natural slope of the hillside, lay a root cellar that could have supplied a small village through the hardest winter. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding ceramic crocks filled with preserved vegetables, wild fruits packed in their own juices, and mysterious preparations that gave off complex fragrances when Hope lifted their lids for inspection. Turnips and potatoes filled wooden bins, while strings of dried corn and beans hung from the ceiling like decorative garlands that happened to represent months of careful labor. "My grandmother's methods," Matthew explained when Hope asked about his preservation techniques. Cahto women knew how to make food last through the lean months, how to capture summer's abundance for winter's need. His hands moved over the stored provisions with obvious pride, touching jars and bundles like old friends. "Some of this is 3 years old and still good. Time and patience, that's all it takes." But it was the herb garden that truly captured Hope's imagination. A carefully tended plot where Matthew had encouraged the growth of both native and cultivated plants that served dual purposes as food and medicine. Wild mint grew alongside cultivated sage, while what looked like ordinary weeds revealed themselves to be valuable additions to any cook's arsenal when Matthew identified them by name and use. Lamb's quarters that could substitute for spinach, purslane with its thick succulent leaves that added tartness to salads, wild garlic that grew in shaded corners where domestic onions would never thrive. "This is a fortune," Hope said softly, kneeling to examine a patch of what Matthew called Indian potatoes, small tubers that grew wild but had been encouraged to spread through careful cultivation. Most people walk past these plants every day without realizing they're looking at food. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her eyes bright with possibilities. "With what you have here, we could eat like royalty all winter," Matthew felt a surge of satisfaction at her recognition of his efforts, realizing that he had been hoping for exactly this kind of appreciation from someone who would understand the skill and knowledge represented by his mountain larder. "There's more," he said, leading her toward a series of wooden platforms built high in the surrounding trees. The elevated platforms, Matthew explained, served as protection against both ground moisture and the bears that would soon begin their final feeding frenzy before winter hibernation. Each platform held different categories of preserved food, organized with the kind of systematic thinking that spoke of someone who had learned to plan months ahead for every possible contingency. Smoked fish wrapped in oiled cloth, pemmican, made from venison and wild berries that would provide concentrated nutrition during the hardest months, and clay vessels sealed with pine pitch that contained fermented preparations whose purposes Hope could only guess at. "Cahto winter food," Matthew said, noting her curiosity about the sealed vessels. "My grandmother called it ghost bread, though I never learned why. Acorn flour fermented with wild yeasts until it develops flavors you won't find anywhere else." He climbed easily to one of the platforms, moving with the fluid confidence of someone completely at home in vertical spaces. "Takes months to prepare properly, but it keeps indefinitely and provides nutrition when fresh food becomes impossible to find." Hope watched him work with growing admiration for the complexity of the system he had created. This was not the random hoarding of someone worried about running out of food. This was the methodical preparation of someone who understood that surviving mountain winters required thinking like a general planning a campaign. Every calorie had been considered, every possible need anticipated, every contingency planned for with the kind of thoroughness that meant the difference between thriving and merely enduring until spring. "How long did it take you to set all this up?" she asked as they climbed down from the cache platforms. 8 years, Matthew replied simply. "Started the first winter with nothing but what I could hunt and trap. Nearly starved that first February when a late storm lasted 3 weeks and I couldn't get out to check my snares." His expression grew distant with memory. "Promised myself that would never happen again. Each year I added something, improved something, learned something that made the next winter easier." That afternoon, Matthew began teaching Hope the specific techniques he used for long-term food preservation, skills that would be essential if she intended to contribute meaningfully to their winter preparations. They started with the simplest methods, salt curing strips of venison over carefully banked coals that provided steady heat without the temperature spikes that would ruin the meat. Hope had preserved food before, but never with the precision and attention to detail that Matthew demonstrated. "Salt draws out moisture," he explained, showing her how to massage coarse crystals into the meat fibers with exactly the right amount of pressure. But too much salt, too fast, and the outside seals before the inside has a chance to cure properly. The meat spoils from within, and you don't know until it's too late. His hands worked the venison strips with practiced efficiency, each motion economical and purposeful. Patience and consistency, that's what makes the difference. Hope found herself fascinated by the intersection of his Cahto heritage with practical frontier survival skills. He showed her how to smoke fish using specific combinations of wood that imparted different flavors while providing the chemical compounds necessary for proper preservation. Oak for steady heat, hickory for flavor, pine for the resins that helped seal the surface against spoilage. Each type of wood served a specific purpose in the complex chemistry of transforming fresh food into provisions that would remain edible for months, but it was the fermentation techniques that truly amazed her. methods that seemed to combine science and intuition in equal measure. Matthew demonstrated how to create controlled environments where beneficial bacteria could transform raw ingredients into preserved foods that were not only shelf-stable, but actually more nutritious than their fresh counterparts. Wild cabbage became something resembling sauerkraut through careful management of salt ratios and temperature, while root vegetables developed complex flavors through controlled decomposition that stopped just short of spoilage. My grandmother said the spirits of the plants wanted to feed us even after they died. Matthew told her as they worked together to prepare another batch of the mysterious fermented acorn preparation. But only if we showed them proper respect through careful preparation and patient waiting. His hands shaped the mixture with reverent attention, as if he were performing a sacred ritual rather than simply preparing food, working side by side. Through the long afternoon, Hope and Matthew fell into the comfortable rhythm of people who understood that meaningful conversation grew naturally from shared labor. She told him about her grandmother's preservation methods, techniques developed in the warm climate of Central California, where the challenges were heat and insects rather than cold and moisture. He described the complex seasonal cycles that governed mountain life, the subtle signs that predicted weather changes weeks in advance, the careful timing required to gather wild foods at their peak of flavor and nutrition. Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Hope said as they worked together to hang newly prepared meat strips in the smokehouse. The afternoon sun slanted through the wooden slats, creating patterns of light and shadow that transformed the simple structure into something approaching art. She raised me after my parents died, Matthew replied, his voice carrying the weight of old grief that had been processed into acceptance rather than bitterness. Cholera epidemic when I was 12. She took me in even though feeding another mouth meant less for everyone else in the village. He adjusted the position of a meat strip with careful precision. Taught me that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human in the process. Hope understood the deeper meaning in his words, recognizing the philosophy that had guided his approach to mountain life. He had not simply retreated from civilization. He had created his own version of it, based on principles that honored both his heritage and his need for independence. The careful attention to food preservation, the systematic approach to seasonal preparation, the respect for traditional knowledge combined with practical innovation, all of it spoke of someone who refused to let isolation diminish his humanity. What about you? Matthew asked as they moved on to preparing vegetables for winter storage. What brought you to California in the first place? The question was casual, but Hope heard the genuine interest behind it, the desire to understand her story without pushing for more information than she was comfortable sharing. Hope chose her words carefully, revealing enough truth to satisfy his curiosity while keeping the most dangerous parts of her story safely hidden. My family came north from Mexico when I was young, she said, focusing on the carrots she was cleaning rather than meeting his eyes. Looking for opportunities like everyone else. We settled in Sonoma County, where my father found work in the vineyards and my mother took in sewing to help make ends meet. The story was true as far as it went, though it left out crucial details about the violence that had eventually driven her away from everything familiar and safe. She described her childhood in carefully edited terms, painting pictures of family celebrations where her cooking skills had been developed and refined, community gatherings where food served as the centerpiece for cultural preservation and social connection. Sounds like you had a good childhood, Matthew observed, and Hope heard the note of wistfulness in his voice. His own childhood had been cut short by tragedy, she realized, leaving him with memories of love and loss that probably made her tales of family gatherings particularly poignant. I did, Hope replied honestly, until I didn't. She looked up to find him watching her with understanding rather than curiosity, recognizing the tone of someone who had learned that some stories were too painful for casual telling. Sometimes good things end badly, and you have to decide whether to let the ending ruin the beginning, or find a way to carry the good parts forward. Matthew nodded slowly, recognizing wisdom earned through experience rather than simply quoted from others. "That's why you cook the way you do," he said, making a connection she hadn't expected him to articulate. "You're not just preparing food, you're keeping something alive." Hope felt tears threaten at the accuracy of his observation. He had identified the driving force behind her dedication to culinary excellence in a way that few people had ever understood. "Food is memory," she said softly. "When I cook my grandmother's recipes, she's still alive in some way. When I use techniques my mother taught me, I can still hear her voice guiding my hands." That night they sat on the cabin's small porch, sharing a simple supper of bread and preserved meat while watching the sun disappear behind the western peaks. The air carried the bite of approaching winter, but inside the circle of warmth created by their shared meal and comfortable conversation, the cold felt distant and manageable. Hope had prepared the bread that morning using Matthew's fermented acorn flour combined with wild wheat she had found growing in a sunny meadow, creating something that bridged the gap between his traditional foods and her own culinary heritage. "This bread," Matthew said, breaking off another piece and savoring its complex flavor. "It tastes like it belongs here somehow. Like it grew out of the mountain itself rather than being imposed from outside." He looked at her with renewed appreciation. "You understand something about this place that most outsiders never figure out." Hope felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise, recognizing that acceptance from someone like Matthew Eaglerun meant something more valuable than simple approval. He had chosen to live apart from the world, not out of misanthropy, but out of a dedication to principles that mainstream society seemed to have abandoned. His endorsement suggested that she might have found not just temporary shelter, but a place where her own values and skills were truly appreciated. "I understand about needing to belong somewhere," she said, watching stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "About finding a place where you can be yourself without having to explain or apologize or pretend to be something you're not." She pulled her shawl closer against the evening chill. "This mountain feels like that kind of place." Matthew was quiet for a long moment, processing her words and the emotions behind them. "It is," he said finally. "At least, it has been for me. The question is whether it can be that for two people without losing what makes it special." Hope heard the vulnerability in his admission, the recognition that allowing her to stay represented a risk to the carefully constructed sanctuary he had built over 8 years of solitary life. "We'll find out," she said simply. "But I promise you this, I have no intention of trying to change what you've created here. I just want to be part of it, to contribute to it, to help make it even better than it already is." As if to seal her promise, she reached into her apron and withdrew a small wrapped bundle, placing it in his hands with the careful ceremony of someone presenting a gift of particular significance. "My grandmother's sourdough starter," she said as he unwrapped the cloth to reveal a ceramic jar sealed with wax. "It's been alive for more than 50 years, fed and tended by 3 generations of women in my family. I'd like it to live here now, if you'll help me keep it going." Matthew held the jar with reverent care, understanding that he was being entrusted with something far more valuable than simple cooking ingredients. This was living history, a connection to traditions and people that stretched back through decades of careful preservation. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We'll keep it alive together." 3 weeks had passed since Hope's arrival, and the mountain had settled into the rhythm of two people learning to share space without stepping on each other's dreams. The morning mist clung to the valley below like ancestral spirits reluctant to leave the sacred places of their earthly wanderings, while above the tree line, the first snow had already begun to dust the highest peaks with winter's inevitable promise. Hope stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms full of the wild herbs she had been gathering for their winter medicine chest, when she spotted movement on the trail far below that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. 4 men on horseback, climbing steadily up the winding path that Matthew had assured her was known only to a handful of Cahto hunters and the occasional lost prospector. But these riders moved with the purposeful determination of people who knew exactly where they were going, their horses picking their way through the rocky terrain with the careful precision of animals, being guided by experienced mountain men. Hope dropped her gathered herbs and ran toward the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized the inevitable arrival of the past she had been running from. Matthew was inside, working on a pair of snowshoes that would be essential once the heavy snows began, his hands moving with the patient skill of someone who understood that winter preparations could not be rushed or postponed. He looked up when she burst through the door, immediately recognizing the fear in her expression as something far more serious than concern about approaching weather or wild animals. "Riders," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. 4 men, maybe 5, coming up the main trail from the valley. She moved to the window, peering through the gaps in the wooden shutters that Matthew had installed more for privacy than protection. "They're not lost, Matthew. They know where they're going." Matthew set down his work and joined her at the window, his expression shifting from concern to the kind of focused attention that had kept him alive during 8 years of solitary mountain living. The riders were still too distant to identify individually, but their formation and the way they handled their horses suggested military or law enforcement training. More troubling was the fact that they were armed with rifles, carried in positions that indicated readiness for trouble, rather than simple hunting or self-defense. "You know who they are," Matthew said. It wasn't a question. He had seen enough of Hope's carefully controlled reactions to understand that her arrival on his mountain had not been the result of simple wanderlust or economic opportunity. Someone had been hunting her, and now they had found her trail. Hope's hands trembled as she watched the approaching riders, memories flooding back of the night that had changed everything. The night that had transformed her from Esperanza Torres, beloved daughter and skilled cook, into Hope, the fugitive woman who carried knives and looked over her shoulder with practiced paranoia. "The leader is Carlos Mendoza," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He used to court me, back when I lived with my family in Sonoma County. When I refused his proposal, he didn't take it well." Matthew waited patiently as Hope gathered the courage to tell him the story. She had been hiding behind careful half-truths and strategic omissions. She moved away from the window, settling into one of his hand-carved chairs, as if the simple act of sitting might make the words easier to find. Her hands worked nervously in her lap, twisting the fabric of her skirt as she prepared to share secrets that could destroy the sanctuary they had been building together. "Carlos wasn't just any suitor," she began, her voice gaining strength as she committed to honesty. "His family owns most of the land between Sonoma and Santa Rosa, thousands of acres of vineyards and cattle ranches that make them the most powerful people in 3 counties. When Carlos decided he wanted something, he was accustomed to getting it, whether through money, influence, or intimidation." She described the escalating pressure that had followed her rejection of his marriage proposal, the way her family's small restaurant had suddenly faced health inspections and tax audits that other businesses mysteriously avoided. Her father's construction work had dried up as contractors received subtle warnings about employing men whose daughters didn't show proper respect for their social betters. The harassment had been constant, but carefully legal, designed to force her family into economic desperation that would make Carlos's offer of marriage seem like salvation rather than surrender. "I thought if I married him, it would stop," Hope continued, her voice bitter with self-recrimination. "I thought I could sacrifice myself to protect my parents, my brothers and sisters. But my grandmother saw through his charm to the cruelty underneath. She told me that some men collected beautiful things not to treasure them but to break them, and that Carlos Mendoza was that kind of man." Matthew listened without interruption, understanding that this story needed to be told completely before he could begin to process its implications for their current situation. He had known Hope was running from something, but he was beginning to realize that the threat pursuing her was far more dangerous and persistent than he had imagined. The breaking point had come, Hope explained, when Carlos had grown tired of subtle pressure and decided to demonstrate his power more directly. He had arrived at her family's restaurant with half a dozen armed men, ostensibly for dinner, but actually to make an offer that everyone understood was not really negotiable. Marriage to Hope in exchange for the safety and prosperity of everyone she cared about, or consequences that would extend far beyond simple economic hardship. He touched me, Hope said, her voice flat with remembered horror. Put his hands on me in front of my entire family, claiming the right to sample what he intended to purchase. When I pulled away, he backhanded me so hard I fell into the kitchen hearth. The coals burned through my dress, scarred my shoulder. She unconsciously touched the place where the injury had healed into permanent reminder of that night. That's when I knew talking wouldn't be enough. Matthew watched Hope's face as she described the events that had transformed her from victim to fugitive, seeing in her expression the birth of the steel-hard determination that had carried her up his mountain. She had not simply endured Carlos's assault. She had fought back with the kind of desperate fury that came from knowing that submission meant spiritual death, even if physical survival was temporarily assured. The kitchen knife was right there, Hope said, her voice gaining intensity as she relived the moment when fear had crystallized into action. Sharp enough to fillet fish, heavy enough to chop through bone. When he reached for me again, I buried it in his shoulder, right where the arm meets the chest. Missed his heart by maybe 2 inches, though God knows I was aiming for it. The aftermath had been chaos, she explained, as Carlos's men had tried to decide whether to shoot her on the spot or capture her for their employer's more personal revenge. Her family had used the confusion to help her escape through the restaurant's back door, pressing what little money they had into her hands along with her grandmother's precious cooking supplies and desperate instructions to run as far and as fast as she could manage. I wanted to stay and fight, Hope said, tears beginning to track down her cheeks as she remembered the hardest choice of her life. Wanted to face whatever consequences came from defending myself. But my grandmother made me understand that Carlos would take his revenge on everyone I loved if I didn't disappear completely. My death wouldn't satisfy him, not after being humiliated in front of his men. He would need to destroy my entire family to restore his reputation, so she had run, first south toward Mexico, then north toward Oregon, finally west toward the coast before doubling back inland toward the mountains that had seemed to offer the best chance of permanent concealment. For months she had moved constantly, working where she could find employment, stealing when she couldn't, always watching for signs that Carlos's hunters had picked up her trail. How did they find you here? Matthew asked, though he suspected. He already knew the answer. Hope's cooking skills were too distinctive, too memorable to remain secret for long in communities where good food was rare enough to become the subject of conversation and legend. I got careless, Hope admitted. Stopped in Cedar Ridge last week to trade some of my spices for winter supplies. The general store owner tasted the preserves I'd made from your wild berries, offered to buy everything I could produce. Started asking questions about where I'd learned to cook, whether I might be willing to work in his wife's restaurant. She shook her head in bitter self-recrimination. I should have known word would spread. Should have realized that someone would remember stories about the Mexican girl who could make miracles out of simple ingredients. Matthew moved to his weapon cache, a hidden compartment built into the cabin's stone foundation where he kept the firearms and ammunition that represented his insurance against the day when isolation might not be enough to ensure safety. He had hoped never to need these weapons for anything more threatening than hunting or protection from the occasional aggressive bear. But he had learned during his years with the Cahto that peace was a luxury that required careful preparation and constant vigilance. His arsenal was modest but carefully maintained, consisting of a Spencer repeating rifle that could deliver 7 shots as fast as a man could work the lever, a Colt revolver that had seen service in more conflicts than he cared to remember, and a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot that could stop charging grizzly bear at close range. Each weapon was cleaned, oiled, and ready for immediate use, part of the systematic approach to mountain living that had kept him alive through 8 winters of complete self-reliance. "How many men does Carlos usually travel with?" Matthew asked as he checked the action on the Spencer, his movements efficient and professional in a way that suggested familiarity with violence, even if he preferred to avoid it. "At least a dozen," Hope replied, her voice hollow with the recognition that their situation was probably hopeless. "He has money enough to hire every gunfighter and bounty hunter between San Francisco and Los Angeles. The 4 men we saw are just the advance scouts, the ones who confirm the target before the main force moves in." Matthew absorbed this information with the calm acceptance of someone who had always understood that his mountain sanctuary might one day be challenged by forces beyond his control. He had chosen this life partly because it offered the possibility of dying on his own terms, rather than according to someone else's schedule. And if that choice was now being forced upon him, at least it would be in defense of something worth protecting. "There's a canyon about 2 miles north of here," he said, continuing his weapon preparations while formulating a plan that might give them some chance of survival. "Narrow passage with steep walls on both sides, only one way in or out. If we can reach it before they surround us, we might be able to hold them off long enough for help to arrive." Hope looked at him with growing desperation, understanding that he was talking about making their final stand rather than finding a way to escape the approaching confrontation. "Help from where?" she asked. "You told me yourself that the nearest settlement is 3 days away, and even then it's just a few dozen miners and farmers who have no reason to risk their lives for strangers. Cahto hunting parties use this area during late autumn," Matthew explained, though they both understood he was grasping at slim possibilities rather than probable outcomes. "Some of the younger men know me, remember that I helped their families during the bad winter of '76. If we can hold out long enough, if we're lucky enough that someone hears the gunfire and decides to investigate." He shrugged, acknowledging the long odds while refusing to surrender to despair. Hope watched Matthew prepare for what would almost certainly be his final battle. This man who had offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, except honest work and companionable silence. The guilt was overwhelming, the recognition that her presence had brought death to someone who deserved nothing but the peace he had spent 8 years carefully constructing. She had known this moment would come eventually, had always understood that Carlos would never stop hunting her, but she had allowed herself to hope that the mountains might be vast enough to swallow one fugitive woman completely. "You should go," she said suddenly, the words torn from her throat by the terrible clarity of moral necessity. "Leave me here with whatever weapons you can spare. Take your horse and ride north until you're clear of this mess. Carlos wants me, not you. Without me here to protect, you could disappear into the wilderness for months, maybe years." Matthew looked up from cleaning the Spencer's receiver, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been amusement if their situation hadn't been so desperate. "You think I'd abandon someone under my protection?" he asked. "You think 8 years of solitude have made me forget what honor means, what responsibility looks like?" "This isn't your fight," Hope insisted, though she could see in his expression that her arguments would fall on ears that had already made their decision. "You don't owe me anything beyond what you've already given. I won't be the reason Matthew Eaglerun dies defending a woman he's known for 3 weeks. You're wrong about several things," Matthew said, setting down the rifle and meeting her eyes with steady intensity. "First, anyone who threatens the peace of this mountain is making it my fight whether I choose it or not. Second, I owe you more than you realize. You've given me back parts of myself I thought were lost forever. And third," his voice softened slightly, It's been a long time since I had something worth fighting for besides simple survival. Hope felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the recognition that she had found not just sanctuary, but genuine caring in this remote place where she had expected nothing more than temporary shelter. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered. "Never meant to bring violence to your mountain." "I know," Matthew replied simply. "But running never solved anything permanently, and some fights choose you whether you want them or not." Carlos Mendoza made this inevitable the moment he decided to own something that couldn't be bought. He stood, slinging the rifle across his shoulder with practiced ease. The question now is whether we meet him on ground of our choosing, or wait for him to dictate the terms of our surrender. The next few hours passed in a blur of frantic activity as Matthew and Hope prepared their mountain sanctuary for what would likely be its final battle. They moved their most essential supplies to the canyon position Matthew had identified, creating a defensive position among the rocks that would allow them to control access while protecting themselves from rifle fire. It was good ground for a last stand, Matthew admitted, but it was still just two people against overwhelming odds, and they both understood that their chances of seeing another sunrise were vanishingly small. Hope insisted on preparing one final meal, using the best of their preserved foods to create something that honored both their traditions and their impending sacrifice. She worked with desperate intensity, as if the act of cooking might somehow transform their desperate situation into something approaching normal human experience. The smell of her grandmother's spices filled the canyon air, creating an incongruous atmosphere of celebration in the midst of their preparations for death. "If we don't survive this," Hope said as they shared what might be their last meal together, "I want you to know that these weeks have been the happiest of my adult life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, the feeling of belonging somewhere, of being valued for what I could contribute rather than what someone else wanted to take from me." Matthew nodded, understanding that they were both trying to find words for feelings that had grown beyond simple gratitude or companionship into something deeper and more precious. "Same here," he said simply. "You reminded me that living and surviving aren't the same thing, that a man can have everything he needs for his body and still be starving in his soul." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they settled into their defensive positions among the canyon rocks, weapons loaded and ready, ears straining for the sound of approaching horses that would signal the beginning of the end. In the distance, a hawk cried out its ancient hunting call, and the mountain wind carried the scent of pine resin and approaching winter, as if the world itself were preparing to witness the final chapter of their brief but meaningful partnership. The sound of horses' hooves on stone echoed through the canyon like thunder announcing Judgment Day, growing steadily louder as Carlos Mendoza and his men approached the narrow passage where Matthew and Hope had chosen to make their stand. From their concealed position among the weathered granite boulders, they could see the riders spreading out in tactical formation, professional in their movements despite the arrogance that showed in their casual approach to what they assumed would be simple prey retrieval. Carlos himself rode at the center of the formation, a man in his 30s whose expensive clothes and silver-mounted saddle spoke of wealth that had never known real hardship or genuine consequence. Even at a distance, Hope could see the way he carried his injured arm, still favoring the shoulder where her kitchen knife had found its mark months ago. The scar would be a permanent reminder of the night when Esperanza Torres had refused to be owned, had chosen violence over submission in a moment that had changed both their lives forever. Esperanza. Carlos's voice carried clearly through the canyon air, amplified by the stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I know you're up there somewhere hiding like a wounded animal, but this game has gone on long enough. Come down and face the consequences of your choices like the woman you claim to be." Hope pressed herself deeper into the rocky crevice where Matthew had positioned her, fighting the urge to respond to the taunt that had been carefully calculated to provoke exactly that reaction. She could feel Matthew's steady presence beside her, his breathing controlled, and even as he sighted down the barrel of his Spencer rifle, waiting for Carlos to move close enough to make the first shot count. "You're trespassing on my land," Matthew called out instead, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from 8 years of absolute self-reliance in an unforgiving environment. "Turn around and ride back the way you came. The woman is under my protection, and she's not going anywhere with you." Carlos laughed, a sound like breaking glass that spoke of a mind that had never learned to process denial or resistance. Anything other than temporary obstacles to be overcome through superior force. "Your land?" he repeated mockingly. "Show me the deed, mountain man. Show me the legal document that gives you title to even 1 square foot of this wilderness. You're nothing but a squatter, and squatters have no rights that civilized men are bound to respect." The standoff stretched through several tense minutes as both sides evaluated their positions and possibilities, calculating odds and measuring commitment against the potential cost of violence. Carlos had the advantage of numbers and superior firepower, but Matthew held the high ground in terrain he knew intimately, while hope represented the wild card that neither side could fully predict or control. "I'll make this simple for you," Carlos continued, dismounting from his horse with theatrical flourish designed to demonstrate his confidence in the outcome. "Send the woman down, and you can go back to your hermit life with nothing worse than some unpleasant memories. Refuse, and I'll have my men burn you out of these rocks like smoking out a nest of rattlesnakes." Hope could see the other riders positioning themselves to cut off potential escape routes, their rifles trained on the rocky outcropping where she and Matthew had taken shelter. These were not simple ranch hands or casual hired guns, but professional killers who understood their business with the kind of cold competence that came from years of practice. The odds were overwhelming, the outcome probably predetermined. But she found herself surprised by the absence of fear in her own reaction to their desperate situation. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice so low that only he could hear. "There might be another way. If I go with them willingly, if I convince Carlos that you were just an innocent bystander who got caught up in something that wasn't your fight." "No," Matthew replied without taking his eye from the rifle sight, his tone carrying finality. That brooked no argument. "Some things are worth dying for, and some things are worth killing for. A man's given word is both." He shifted slightly, adjusting his aim as Carlos moved into better position. "Besides, you think he'd let me live after seeing his face, knowing his name? We're both dead if we surrender. At least this way we die on our feet," Hope understood. The logic of his position, even as part of her, rebelled against the necessity of involving him in what should have been her personal reckoning with the consequences of her choices. But there was something else in his voice, something that went beyond mere tactical calculation or stubborn honor. He was fighting not just for her safety, but for the principle that some sanctuaries should remain inviolate, that some refuges deserved protection against those who would violate them for personal gain. The first shot came without warning, a rifle bullet that splinged off the granite inches from Hope's head and sent stone fragments flying like deadly hail. Carlos had apparently grown tired of negotiation and decided to demonstrate his seriousness through immediate action, trusting his superior numbers to overwhelm any resistance that 2 desperate fugitives might offer. Matthew's return fire was immediate and precise, the Spencer rifle speaking with authority that dropped one of Carlos's men from his saddle before the echo of the first shot had finished bouncing off the canyon walls. The wounded man rolled behind a boulder, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that mixed English profanity with Spanish prayers in a combination that would have been amusing under different circumstances. "Son of a bitch knows how to shoot," one of Carlos's remaining men called out, suddenly less confident about what had seemed like a simple matter of superior firepower, overwhelming desperate resistance. "That was a 200-yard shot in tricky wind, boss. Maybe we should reconsider our approach." But Carlos was beyond rational calculation now. driven by months of frustrated pursuit and the intolerable humiliation of being defied by a woman. He had considered his rightful property. Kill them both. He screamed, his voice cracking with rage that bordered on hysteria. I want that woman's body brought to me whether she's breathing or not. The canyon erupted into chaos as rifle fire echoed off stone walls and ricocheted in directions that made it impossible to determine the source of incoming bullets. Hope found herself pressed against sun-warmed granite while lead whined overhead, her heart hammering with the primitive terror that came from being hunted by predators who possessed both the means and the will to destroy her completely. Matthew worked his rifle with mechanical precision, each shot carefully aimed and deliberately fired, making every round count against opponents who seemed to have ammunition to waste. His Cahto grandfather had taught him to hunt with weapons that could not be quickly reloaded, instilling habits of patience and accuracy that served him well in situations where missing meant dying. The battle might have continued until Matthew's ammunition ran out and Carlos's superior numbers inevitably prevailed. But the mountain itself intervened in the form of 3 Cahto hunters who had been tracking an injured elk through the high country, when the sound of gunfire had drawn their attention to the unusual commotion in what should have been peaceful wilderness. The arrival of additional combatants transformed the tactical situation in ways that neither Matthew nor Carlos had anticipated, adding an element of unpredictability that immediately shifted the balance of power. The Cahto warriors moved through the rocky terrain with the fluid silence of men who had learned stealth as children, positioning themselves to command the canyon entrance while remaining invisible to the overconfident pursuers who had assumed they faced only 2 isolated opponents. White men fight on sacred ground, came a voice from somewhere among the rocks, speaking accented English with the kind of calm authority that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Disturb spirits of ancestors with noise and blood. This not acceptable behavior in place of power. Carlos spun his horse in confusion, trying to locate the source of the new voice while simultaneously maintaining his focus on the rocky outcropping where his primary targets remained concealed. This is none of your concern, Indian, he called out with the automatic arrogance of someone who had never learned to consider native peoples as anything other than obstacles to be removed or ignored. White man's business doesn't require red man's permission. The response came in the form of an arrow that materialized from nowhere to bury itself in the ground directly between Carlos's horse's front hooves, causing the animal to rear and nearly unseat its rider. The message was clear enough that even Carlos could interpret it correctly, though his expression suggested he was having difficulty processing the concept that his superiority might not be universally acknowledged. Sacred ground, the voice repeated, this time with unmistakable menace underlying the calm tone. White men leave now, or spirits claim blood debt for disturbing rest of those who sleep in stone. Cahto do not give second warning. What followed was not the climactic battle that Carlos had planned, but rather the rapid dissolution of his force as hired guns began to realize that their employer's personal vendetta was not worth dying for in a remote canyon surrounded by hostile terrain and increasingly unfriendly natives. Professional killers understood risk assessment in ways that emotional amateurs never learned, and the mathematical certainty of Carlos's ultimate victory had suddenly become a much more complex equation involving unknown numbers of skilled opponents. Fighting on familiar ground, boss, one of his remaining men called out, backing his horse toward the canyon entrance with obvious eagerness to be somewhere else. Maybe we should reconsider this whole operation. Cut our losses and try again when we've got better intelligence about what we're up against. But Carlos was beyond rational retreat, consumed by the kind of rage that made tactical thinking impossible and transformed simple business into personal crusade. He spurred his horse forward toward the rocks where he knew hope was hiding, apparently believing that individual courage could overcome mathematical disadvantage and superior positioning. Matthew's final shot took him center mass before he had covered half the distance to their rocky fortress, the heavy rifle bullets spinning him from his saddle to land, face down in the canyon dust with blood spreading beneath him like spilled wine. The sudden silence that followed was broken only by the sound of his spooked horse galloping back toward the canyon entrance, stirrups flapping against empty space. The surviving members of Carlos's force needed no further encouragement to abandon what had clearly become an untenable situation. Within minutes, the canyon was empty except for Matthew Hope and the invisible Cahto warriors who had turned the tide of battle through the simple expedient of evening the odds when they mattered most. Hope emerged from her rocky shelter, on trembling legs, staring down at the body of the man who had pursued her across hundreds of miles and months of desperate flight. Carlos Mendoza looked smaller in death than he had in life, reduced from terrifying nemesis to simple clay that would soon return to the mountain soil that had claimed so many others who had overestimated their own importance in the grand scheme of natural law. "It's over," Matthew said simply, lowering his rifle and walking to where she stood transfixed by the sight of her tormentor's final defeat. "He can't hurt you anymore, can't hurt anyone else. You're free." From somewhere among the rocks came the voice of their invisible ally, speaking now in what Hope recognized as Cahto language, though she could not understand the words. Matthew listened respectfully, then replied in the same tongue, his pronunciation careful and formal, as befitted someone addressing elders deserving of particular respect. "They're saying the spirits are satisfied," Matthew translated for Hope's benefit. "The blood debt has been paid, the sacred ground has been cleansed. We can stay if we choose, but we should remember that some victories come with obligations to honor what was sacrificed to achieve them." The autumn moon hung full and silver over the mountain canyon where death had visited and departed, leaving behind only memories and the kind of profound silence that follows the resolution of long-carried burdens. Hope and Matthew worked together in the pale light, using shovels and pickaxes to dig graves in the rocky soil for Carlos and his fallen companion, performing the grim but necessary work that honor demanded even for enemies who had died pursuing selfish ends. The Cahto warriors had vanished as silently as they had appeared, fading back into the wilderness after ensuring that the sacred ground would be respected in the aftermath of violence. "We could have left them for the scavengers," Hope said, as they lowered Carlos's wrapped body into the shallow grave they had managed to carve from the stubborn mountain earth. "After everything he put me through, everything he cost my family, it would have been justice of a sort." Matthew paused in his work, leaning on the shovel handle while he considered her words and the emotions behind them. The moonlight cast his weathered features in stark relief, making him appear like some ancient statue commemorating the eternal struggle between civilization and wilderness, between mercy and vengeance. "Maybe," he said finally, "but we're not burying him for his sake. We're doing it for ours, to make sure we can sleep peacefully in this place, without carrying the weight of what we left undone." They worked in companionable silence after that, filling the graves and marking them with simple stone cairns that would weather the seasons and serve as reminders of the day when violence had visited their sanctuary and been turned away through courage and unexpected alliance. When the work was finished, they stood together in the moonlight, hands dirty with earth and honest labor, breathing the clean mountain air that seemed somehow purified by the completion of their grim duty. Hope felt something fundamental shift inside her chest as she stared down at the fresh grave that held the remains of her tormentor, a loosening of tension that she had carried for so many months that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to exist without the constant weight of fear pressing against her shoulders. Carlos Mendoza was dead, his pursuit ended, his threats silenced forever by Matthew's steady aim and the mountain's rough justice. "It's really over," she whispered, the words carrying wonder as much as relief. "For the first time in almost a year, I can think about tomorrow without wondering if I'll live to see it." She looked up at Matthew, seeing in his face the same mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction that she felt in her own bones. I don't know how to thank you for what you've given me." The walk back to the cabin felt different from their desperate flight to the canyon that morning, though the physical distance remained exactly the same. They moved slowly through the moonlit forest, no longer fugitives racing toward an uncertain confrontation, but simply two people returning home after completing a difficult but necessary task. The familiar sense of pine resin and wood smoke guided them through the darkness, while overhead the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but somehow comforting in their eternal constancy. Matthew had gathered up Carlos's expensive rifle and ammunition, practical salvage that would be useful in the months to come, while Hope carried the leather saddlebags that had contained the dead man's traveling supplies. They had not spoken of what they found there, but the gold coins and folded banknotes represented resources that could make their mountain life significantly more comfortable if used wisely and sparingly. Strange how quiet it feels, Hope observed as they emerged into the clearing where Matthew's cabin sat bathed in silver moonlight. After the chaos and violence of the afternoon, the familiar domesticity of the scene seemed almost surreal, as if they had stepped through some invisible barrier separating the world of conflict from the realm of ordinary life. Like the mountain itself is holding its breath, Matthew nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Violence had a way of changing the essential character of places, leaving invisible scars that sensitive people could feel long after the physical evidence had been cleaned away or grown over. But this felt different, he realized, less like aftermath than like renewal, as if the mountain had tested them and found them worthy of the sanctuary they had claimed. Inside the cabin, Hope immediately began the ritual that had sustained her through every crisis and transition of her adult life, moving with practiced efficiency to prepare food that would serve as both nourishment and celebration. From Matthew's carefully preserved stores, she selected ingredients that spoke of abundance rather than mere survival, creating a meal that would mark this day as the beginning of something new rather than simply the end of something old. The table that night bore a feast worthy of a special occasion, though neither Hope nor Matthew spoke directly about what they were celebrating. Wild turkey roasted with herbs and stuffed with acorn bread, vegetables from Matthew's garden prepared with spices that had traveled across oceans and continents to reach this remote mountain clearing, preserves made from berries that grew nowhere else in the world except in the high meadows where ancient peoples had once gathered to give thanks for the mountain's generosity. They ate slowly, savoring not just the carefully prepared food, but the luxury of sharing a meal without the shadow of pursuit hanging over their heads. For the first time since her arrival, Hope felt truly present in the moment, able to appreciate the simple pleasure of Matthew's company, without the constant background fear that had colored every interaction for so many months. "Tell me about your plans," Matthew said as they shared the bottle of wine that Carlos had carried in his saddlebags, probably intending to celebrate his anticipated victory. "Now that you're free to choose your own direction, what do you want to do with the rest of your life?" Hope considered the question carefully, realizing that for months she had been so focused on simple survival that she had stopped thinking in terms of actual choices and genuine preferences. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long I've been running toward nothing except away from Carlos. I've forgotten how to think about what I actually want rather than what I'm trying to avoid." She looked around the cabin that had become more familiar and comfortable than any place she had lived since childhood, taking in the details that spoke of Matthew's careful attention to creating a home rather than mere shelter. The hand-carved furniture, the books that revealed intellectual curiosity despite his chosen isolation, the small touches that transformed functional space into something approaching sanctuary. "I know what I don't want," she continued slowly. "I don't want to go back to being afraid, don't want to live in places where I have to hide who I am or pretend to be less skilled than I actually am. I want to cook for people who appreciate good food, want to use my knowledge to create something meaningful rather than just getting by from day to day." Matthew listened with the focused attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, hearing not just her words, but the emotions and possibilities they contained. "What if you didn't have to choose between safety and purpose?" he asked. Quietly, "What if you could have both right here?" Hope felt her heart begin to beat faster as she recognized the direction their conversation was taking, though she tried to maintain the careful emotional distance that had become second nature during months of constant vigilance. "What are you saying, Matthew?" "I'm saying that this mountain has room for two people who understand its value," Matthew replied, his voice carrying the same steady certainty that had characterized his decision to stand with her against Carlos's pursuit. "I'm saying that 8 years of solitude have taught me the difference between being alone by choice and being lonely despite my preferences. I'm saying that you've reminded me what it means to share life with someone, rather than simply existing in parallel isolation." He stood and walked to the window that overlooked his carefully tended garden, the preserved food stores, the workshop, where he crafted the tools that sustained their mountain life. "I can offer you partnership," he said. "Not just shelter, but genuine collaboration in building something worth protecting. Your skills combined with my knowledge of this place. Your cooking paired with my hunting and preservation techniques. Your company balancing my tendency toward hermit behavior." Hope joined him at the window, looking out over the moonlit clearing that had become more home to her in 3 weeks than anywhere she had lived since childhood. "And what would you want in return?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "What we've already been sharing," Matthew said simply. "Honest work, companionable silence, the pleasure of eating meals that someone prepared with care instead of just throwing meat over a fire and hoping for the best." He turned to face her directly. "I want someone to talk to who understands that some things are worth preserving, even when the rest of the world seems bent on destroying them. I want someone who appreciates the luxury of choosing solitude rather than having it forced on you by circumstances." Hope felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes as she recognized the offer being made, not just for physical safety, but for genuine partnership based on mutual respect and shared values. "Are you asking me to marry you, Matthew Eaglerun?" "I'm asking you to stay," he replied. "Marriage, partnership, companionship, whatever words you want to use for choosing to build a life together instead of just surviving separately. I'm asking you to help me turn this place into something more than just a hiding spot from the world's complications." Hope's answer came not in words but in action, moving to the trunk where she kept her most precious possessions and withdrawing a small bundle wrapped in her grandmother's silk scarf. Inside lay her mother's wedding ring, a simple band of Mexican silver that had survived years of hardship and months of desperate flight, saved against the day when she might again have reason to believe in permanence and partnership. Then, "I accept," she said, slipping the ring under her own finger where it caught the lamplight like a promise made visible. "I accept your offer of partnership, your proposal of shared purpose, your invitation to help you build something worth protecting in this place that has already protected us both." Matthew's smile was like sunrise breaking over the eastern peaks, transforming his weathered features with an expression of pure joy that made him appear years younger. He took her hands in his own, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the strength that had carried her through trials that would have broken weaker spirits. "Welcome home, Hope Torres," he said, using her chosen name with the same reverence he might have offered to the mountain spirits that had guided their defense. "Welcome to a life where you can be exactly who you are without apology or explanation." Outside, the mountain settled into deeper quiet as the moon began its descent toward the western horizon, while inside the cabin 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds began planning a future built on shared work, mutual respect, and the simple miracle of excellent food prepared with love. In the morning they would begin the practical work of combining their lives and skills, but tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, and for the recognition that some sanctuaries were meant to be shared, The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls that would witness many more such evenings of companionable planning and quiet contentment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities, but tonight belonged to the understanding that they had found not just safety, but genuine happiness in this remote place where the modern world's complications could not reach. Some stories ended with dramatic gestures and grand proclamations, but the best ones concluded with the simple recognition that love could take root anywhere two people were willing to tend it with patience, care, and the daily miracle of choosing each other again and again.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.